All right, we're now joined via Zoom by Zikhona Ndlebe Researcher and Advocacy Officer at Judges Matter to weigh in on the JSC interview underway in to fill the vacancies in various courts across the country. A very warm welcome to you, Zikhona. Thanks very much for joining us here on SABC News.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Well, let's start here. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting the fact that, of course, Luleka Flatela was questioned about, her role in activism, and of course, sort of dispelling in some ways the assertion that her role as an activist may pose a challenge should she be appointed as a judge. One would think that your role as an activist would actually, put you in good stead and put you in good light. But this was also painted in a way that it could perhaps be negative, in that she might not necessarily be impartial as would a judge need to be.
You're absolutely correct. That was put to her, but she answered the question in that each person has to be an activist to a certain extent and in some sense. So I think her views about being an activist stem from her having assisted various students in the Fees Must Fall, during the Fees Must Fall movement. She's also assisted various people, including one of the members of the AFF who sits in the NCOP in Parliament, get out of prison after many years having tried to get out of prison, and she assisted in that sense. So I think that's where she comes from, in saying that she is an activist. And as a judge, obviously, the role of a judge is quite different from the role of an ordinary person, because judges are held to a higher standard. So when a person who sits on the bench is an activist, I would think that that is not to say that they will disregard or not apply the law, but it would be to consider all views that are presented in a case, for example, and to consider the society, the social context in which a case is being heard. So I think that is where she's coming from in speaking about being an activist.
Yeah, you mentioned something quite important, the fact that judges are indeed held to a higher standard. Let's talk about that then. I mean, the prerequisites or the requirements for those who want to fill these vacancies, and certainly for those who have been shortlisted. We always hear, which is now a cliche, the familiar, fit and proper persons, that is a requirement for any judge and actually anyone in the legal world. But one must certainly have more than that to succeed in this particular role. I mean, we're talking the highest of the benches, and when we're talking about what is being interviewed for currently by the JSC.
So the JSC interviewed candidates for the SCA, Supreme Court of Appeal, for the High Court for secondment to the Land Claims Court, for the Competition Appeal Court. So it's quite a few important roles that the JSC has been interviewing for. And if one wants to become a judge in our superior courts, they have to be fit and proper. And that is in terms of Section 174 of the Constitution. Those are the requirements. But I think your question really speaks to the issue of having a criteria by the JSC that is considered when candidates are being appointed. And a person who wants to be a judge has to be a person of integrity. They have to have the necessary energy and skills and motivation, expertise. And what I'm speaking from right now, it is the guidelines that were adopted by the JSC at the beginning of this year in April, just before the April interviews. Those are the Mohammed guidelines that the JSC adopted, which are to a certain extent correct. And just speaking about criteria and the JSC, we heard during a media briefing that the JSC has looked at the criteria, the guidelines, and has been working on that, and will call for comments on guidelines and the criteria that it will be applying moving forward. And that is a process that's going to take place after these interviews. So basically, when one wants to become a judge, they need to understand that it is not the same standard as an ordinary person. They have to have certain skills, qualifications, and competencies.
Yeah, we're talking about women in different sectors, and in fact, the president today was addressing the Women Economic Assembly and talking about the fact that, it seems that women are not getting to those roles that they should be in, and I'm actually going to bring it to the judiciary as well. It is quite interesting to note the fact that, only two women made it, though, to the SCA, and the fact that we're always seeing less representation of women than we are of men in any of these interviews. And it's always a case of, we're talking about the women, but we're talking about them in the sense as though, it should be a favor to them to be put in these positions. But these are highly qualified people. But it does seem as though, judiciary is still pretty much patriarchal. And I wonder if this is something that is going to be addressed.
It's certainly something that has to be addressed because our constitution requires our judiciary to be representative of race, the different races and gender that we have. So it's a concern. For example, right now, there are currently no women in leadership positions, and that is a big problem that we have as Judges Matter. It's a concern. And currently, the JSC has decided to recommend 2 women to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and Ms. Luleka Flatela is the 3rd woman to have to be recommended to the High Court for secondment to the Land Claims Court. So it's 3 women. And we saw yesterday that there were other 2 women that were interviewed for the Electoral Court, chairperson and a judge member of the Electoral Court. And those women have not been recommended for appointment. So it's not to say that there aren't any women that avail themselves for these positions, but the JSC has not recommended as many women as we would have liked to have seen. And of course, we are not saying that the JSC must just recommend women for appointment to leadership positions without...
but surely that in itself is a problem. That in itself is a problem from the point of recommendation. I mean, the fact that there aren't as many women that could be represented. And of course, we're not saying that men should not be represented, but surely this is something that needs to be questioned as to why so few women are then recommended into these particular positions, isn't it?
It's definitely a problem. It's a big problem, and we are very concerned about it. And I think another problem is the fact that not many women bring themselves forward for interviewing by the JSC. So if you look at the number of women that are in these interviews, it's quite a few. So the problem is, and this is something that was mentioned during the JSC interviews, there are women who study law, there are women who become advocates, there are women who become attorneys, but they don't filter up to positions of leadership. They don't really filter up to becoming judges. Yeah. So that is the real problem. So what has to be done is to look at what is the problem from the bottom. Why are they not filtering up? Yeah. And it is going to require the Legal Practice Council to play a role. It's going to require the bar to play a role, not just the judiciary, because we need to see more women filtering up to the leadership positions. Currently, you have no women in leadership position, and that's a big concern.
All right. Zikhona, thank you very much for giving us your time, ma'am. We certainly do appreciate your time here on SABC News. That's Zikhona Ndlebe, who's a researcher and advocacy officer at Judges Matter, of course, on the back of those interviews which are currently underway. The JSC, of course, interviewing candidates for some of the divisions of the courts.